Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share cannibal horror stories. First story. This story was shared by you/Midnight00R. My girlfriend is a cannibal. A horrible curse befell my girlfriend and now she can only eat human meat, and I'm her personal butcher. It all started 2 years ago when my girlfriend became very ill and struggled to eat. Anything she did eat would usually come back up a few minutes later. At first, the doctors weren't sure what was wrong with her, theorizing it may be a stomach ulcer, but after her health continued to deteriorate, further tests revealed that it wasn't stomach ulcers but instead stomach cancer. This news shattered our world. Never in a million years could we have guessed it would be cancer. Elaine was in her mid-20s, and I know that doesn't make you immune, but it sure makes you feel that way. The cancer was caught pretty late and neither of us had a lot of money, essentially living paycheck to paycheck, so our medical options weren't great. We live in Buffalo, meaning we were just 30 miles too far south for good and affordable medical care, and with Elaine unable to work I made the choice to take on a second job as a nightly garbage collector. It didn't pay great, but beggars can't be choosers. It was at this job, however, that I met Eli Carson. Eli was a wild dude. He was only 30 but looked easily mid-40s. He had a shaved head with a singular rat's tail hanging out the back. His eyes were dark green and his face had a long, thick scar going from his right eyebrow down across the bridge of his nose right down to his left cheek. The craziest thing about him, though, is that he grew up in a cult, a sort of offshoot of the Unification Movement cult set up by the more eccentric members. He told me he had been a member from birth and lived on a commune until he was 19, until he escaped. The stories he had from the cult made the night shift go by much quicker, but it was once I told him about Elaine's situation that the funny stories turned serious. Due to his cult links, Eli knew some pretty weird and out there people, and he put me on to someone who he said could cure Elaine 100%. Her name was Madame Arachnia. Eli described her as the craziest mix of genius and psycho I've ever met. He said that she worshipped eldritch gods and that she believed H.P. Lovecraft was not a fiction writer but instead a prophet. However, he promised me that no matter how insane her beliefs were, that nobody else was better equipped to help. I got shot one night while out on a date and I was set to be on crutches for 6 months, but she had me walking in no time, he claimed, though I doubted the veracity of the claim. However, Elaine was quickly running out of options and I couldn't live with myself if we didn't try everything we could. So what if it turned out to be a hoax? It wouldn't change anything about our current situation. Madame Arachnia worked out of a camp deep in a forest at Niagara Gorge. The camp was designed to look like a circus, including a big top tent. Fairy lights hung up all over the camp, connecting the multiple tents and teepees that were dispersed throughout. Up in the left corner just beside the big top was an animal pen that contained some sheep, goats, cows and horses. Madame Arachnia's tent was situated at the back of the camp, guarded by 2 tall men dressed like jesters. However, instead of the usual colorful attire, they wore all black. They wore a skull mask and a vest made of bone, as well as a coal-black jester's hat with little skull bells that jingled as they walked. Both men carried 4 black balloons and 1 white balloon. They led me into the tent, which unsurprisingly was illuminated by multiple fairy lights draped across the roof. There was a strong smell of burning sage and lavender incense, and the floor was covered in hay that crunched whenever someone took a step. I had assumed that Madame Arachnia would be an old lady covered in warts, though that turned out to be very wrong. When she pulled down her shawl she revealed a stunningly beautiful woman with a pale, freckled face, bright yellow eyes and a tattoo of a black widow spider around her right eye. The sides of her head were shaved with the jet black hair on top done into a quiff with a white streak dyed into it. Each one of her fingers wore a golden covering coated with encrusted gems, and she had the letters H and P tattooed on the back of her left and right hands respectively. "Samuel, I'm guessing," she said while pulling off her shawl as I approached. Her yellow eyes staring directly into mine as if she was trying to gawk into my soul. "That's me, though most people call me Sam," I responded while pulling out the wicker chair from under the table so that I could take a seat. "Well, Sam, I understand your dear Elaine has been attacked by a horrible disease," she replied as she picked a small satin black sack off the floor and placed it on the table, the glass contents rattling around inside as she did. "Yep, stomach cancer. We've tried everything that we could afford but nothing's worked and I don't know how long she has left," I explained while biting my lip. I found it hard to discuss these matters with anyone without bursting into tears. Madame sat in silence with her fingers crossed for a few seconds to allow me to regain my composure. Once I did, she continued on. "Cancer is a horrible thing. To me, it is the greatest evil in our universe. It turns our body against us and kills us slowly from the inside, a truly reprehensible disease. People beg their God to cure them, but more often than not neither their God nor their doctor can do anything for them," she replied as she put her hand into the sack and began to rummage around inside. "However, the old ones would never allow a servant to die such a horrible death." After rummaging around for it, but she eventually pulled out a glass vial with a cardboard cork at the top. The vial was full of a crimson-red substance that swirled around in the glass. Madame Arachnia placed the vial into my hand, then with her hand she closed mine over the vial. She held my hand in between both of hers and looked me in the eye again. "I made this concoction, especially for your Elaine. She should drink this as soon as possible, then rest. It'll clear her of all ailments and strengthen her stomach in no time." I'm not sure if it was her confidence or my desire to want her to be correct or maybe a mix of both, but at that moment I completely believed Madame Arachnia. This was going to work. "Thank you so much. What do I owe you?" I asked her as I pulled an envelope out of my jacket which contained $3,000, my entire savings. "Oh, monetary gain means little to me. Elaine's return to health will be of use to my gods. Appeasing them means much more to me than any piece of paper assigned an arbitrary value." Madame Arachnia replied as she lifted her hand up and gestured for me to put the money away. There had been many red flags from my trip to the camp, but this should have been the biggest. Nobody does anything for free, whether they take money or not. In some way they expect to be rewarded for what they have done. However, at the time I didn't think about that. I just thought Madame was just some saint doing good acts in the name of some misplaced belief in fictional gods. How wrong I turned out to be. The first 4 days after Elaine had taken the potion were no different than usual, and I started to believe we had fallen for a stupid hoax. I was angry at myself for falling for such an obviously fake cure, and I was even angrier for having put Elaine through more stress, getting her hopes up again for nothing. On the 5th day, though, things changed for the better. Elaine woke up and seemed to be doing much better. The color had come back to her face and she was full of energy. Her beautiful smile touched each one of her rosy red cheeks in the morning when she woke me up to tell me how amazing she felt. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw how great she looked. If it weren't for the weight loss you wouldn't have believed that she was a cancer patient. However, the good feelings didn't last as she immediately threw up when she ate some toast that I had made for her. We were both shocked when she threw up, and I could tell how much effort Elaine was putting in to stop herself from exploding into tears. It had seemed that we found a cure, but after she threw up it became apparent it had only been a placebo, except it wasn't. We decided to go to the doctor for a checkup, hoping that the potion may have fought back some of the cancer. not enough to return Elaine's appetite but enough to give her back some energy and to give us a fighting chance. However, when the test results came back, the doctors were dumbfounded. The cancer was completely gone. There was no trace at all. The doctors couldn't believe their eyes. Elaine sat in silent shock upon hearing the news, only coming out of it when I threw my arms over her. "I'm alive," she said before beginning to cry as I held her tight in my arms. The doctors informed us that Elaine throwing up when eating was most likely just her body getting used to regular food again and that it would soon return. They told us to ensure that she only ate small portions and soup for the time being, which is all she could usually stomach when she was sick. However, over the next few days she couldn't even stomach that. For days had passed since she got the all clear and she couldn't even eat some toast and soup. The rest of her body had been cured, but it seemed like her stomach had deteriorated. I decided I needed to meet with Madame Arachnia again. If anyone had the answers she would. I just wish it wasn't the answer she gave. When I reached the camp, I was once again greeted by the creepy jesters who walked me into Madame's tent once more. I explained to her that the potion had worked but that Elaine couldn't eat no matter what we tried. Her response to this took my own appetite away from me. "Well, of course, she can't eat. You aren't feeding her the right meat," she said as she placed some tarot cards face down on the table, keeping her eyes focused on them as she spoke to me. "Well, you never told me that there was food she couldn't eat. What can she eat?" I replied, expecting to get an answer like horse or rat. However, the answer was much, much worse. "Humans," she replied as she lifted her head to finally look at me and grin. My heart sank into my stomach upon hearing this, and I began to sweat profusely before lashing out in anger. "Don't joke with me!" I screamed as I jumped up from my seat and lashed a closed fist against the table, causing the tarot cards to fly off the table and onto the floor. Both of the jesters took a step forward preparing to attack me, but Madame ordered them to step back before beckoning for me to retake my seat. "Sit down and relax, Sam. I am not joking. My potions aren't a miracle they cure, but they need something in return. In this case, Elaine's stomach has been modified to fight off all infections and diseases, but in return, she can only eat her fellow humans," she explained as she reached her right hand out and called for one of the jesters, who then carried over a lunchbox and placed it on the table, opening it up to reveal a liver. "This is a human liver. Take it home and cook it for about 6 minutes on each side, then serve it. It'll be the tastiest meal Elaine has ever had, and once she has had the taste for human meat she'll never want to go back. Not that she has a choice," Arachnia said before starting to chuckle as she placed the top back on the box and slid it across the table to me. The anger I felt before quadrupled as I sat there being mocked. However, I took a few deep breaths and composed myself, knowing that Madame's 2 goons might not be held back by her a second time if I lost it again. "And how do I know this is a human liver? This could easily just be a liver from one of your animals. I want you to stop playing around with me and give me a proper answer. Stop this frustrating joke, please." I calmly replied as I sat back in my seat and crossed my arms. Madame didn't immediately respond. Instead, she turned her head to look at the jester to the left of her and nodded to him. Once she did, he walked away to the back of the tent, coming back a moment later with a plastic bag slung over his shoulder. He walked up to the table and dropped the bag directly onto it. The full weight of the bag hit the tabletop with a loud thud before a head rolled out from it, a human head. Once the head rolled out, I leapt from my seat and screamed before the jester put both hands on my shoulder and forced me back down into the chair, ordering me to sit now, with a hoarse voice. "We don't do jokes around here, Samuel. If I say something I mean it," Madame Arachnia said with a serious tone, though I was no longer looking at her. my eyes were transfixed on the detached head sitting on the table in front of me. The head looked to have belonged to an older man in either his 40s or 50s, going off his wrinkled face and long gray hair with some spots of bald dispersed throughout. His facial expression was one of immense pain and his eyes had been gouged out. I started to wonder what this man had done to earn such a fate, but that mattered little to me. What did matter, however, was how dangerous Madame Arachnia was. My right leg twitched uncontrollably underneath the table as she spoke, fearing that I may face the same fate as this man. Now, take that lunchbox, leave this camp and never dare return. The boys will see you out, Madame Arachnia said as the jesters approached me and lifted me out of the chair. One of them handed me the lunchbox before both walked me out of the camp and back to civilization. When I got home I cooked the liver just as Madame had told me to and just as she predicted. Elaine loved it, but more importantly she was able to keep it down. I waited until the next day to see if she was able to keep it all down before sitting her down and explaining to her that she had consumed a man's liver. At first, she thought it was a joke, but once I assured her it wasn't she understandably slapped me across the face, then stormed off, leaving me alone with a deep red hand-shaped mark on my face. She didn't return until later that night, but when she did she was much calmer than when she left. It was that night that we accepted we only had two choices going forward: we could either do what needed to be done or allow Elaine to starve. The latter was never an option and there was no plan B, so it was obvious that we would need to kill to keep Elaine alive. I said that I would do it as I had gotten us into this mess. We are, or I should say we were both pretty non-violent people, so just jumping straight into murdering people wasn't easy. We knew we couldn't just kill anyone. Elaine decided that we would choose certain people who deserved to die. So, that explains why I'm sitting in a parking lot across from a 24-hour gym at 1 a.m. waiting for the right person to leave. The right person was Jack Werther, a 33-year-old man and fitness aficionado. He needed to keep himself in top shape to impress the ladies, but when I say ladies I should really say girls, young girls. Jack usually likes them between 13 and 16 and he was into some pretty weird stuff. I know this because Jack has been texting back and forth with Elaine for the last 3 weeks, though he thinks she's a 14-year-old girl. I've done this a few times now, so you might assume I was getting used to it, but if I'm being honest I dread doing this every time. I struggle to sleep for days once I notice that meat is running low, though I thankfully don't have to do this too often. A whole human lasts pretty long, but not as long as you'd hope since it's all Elaine can eat. Most of the body can be used bar the head, hands, and feet, which she struggles to eat, except the eyes, which she enjoys blended up like a smoothie. I had wished Elaine would have picked a weaker, less fitness-loving meal, but we take what we can get and it's hard to survive multiple shots to the head from a hammer no matter how strong and fit you are. I had to sit and wait for Jack for over 2 hours. During that time my usual feelings of fear, anxiousness and paranoia subsided as I tried to focus on even staying awake. However, Jack eventually left the gym and briskly walked up the quiet, empty street and into the darkness. Once I saw him leave I grabbed the hammer out of my bag and followed after him. Second story. This story was shared by you/Zachman220. The Cannibal of the Smoky Mountains. Hurry up, hurry up. I saw it right here. The two boys wandered in the Smoky Mountains. They came upon a dark, gloomy-looking shed. Hey, let's stay here tonight, bro. It's like 2 in the morning and I don't know how to get back. We'll find out where we are tomorrow. Okay, whispered Jesse. Wait, whoa, whoa, whoa. We don't know if anyone lives here, said Danny. It's like halfway crumbled to the damn ground. No one lives here, or at least not in 200 frickin' years. Well, whatever, I rather stay here than outside wandering around the Pennsylvania wilderness. I swear I saw a giant-looking man thing. I can't describe it other than like 8 feet, walked like a man and had something in its hand. It looked like he had a hat on. Danny said, explaining the figure of what he thinks is a man. Whoa, that's messed up, but I think it's your screwed up imagination. The two boys wandered around the old shed house. It was quite small. It had only one bed and some candles along with a desk. It looked like nothing has been touched since the early 1800s. The bed was old, older than any bed they've ever seen. They lit a match with the very few they had on them, and went to bed on the small hay bed. Jesse woke up to a rustling noise under the floorboards. Danny, Danny. What? Danny said with a nagging groan. Do you hear that noise? There was an odd pause, then Danny perked his head to the unexplainable noises. Do you think it's the thing you saw? Jesse suggested. Hell no, you said it yourself, it's just my fucked up imagination. Why are you getting defensive? I'm not, cried Danny, I just want to get through the damn night and get home. This is really messing with my mind, I'm sick of this bullshit. If someone's messing with us, I'm gonna find out who. The boys continued to hear noises throughout the night. They tried to get to sleep, but they simply couldn't. Knowing that something's out there, they were paranoid. Any sound they heard, they jumped. If one of them made a move, they jumped. The boys searched the shed for any weapons they could have used. But what they sought was not what was found, for they found something else that surprised them both. The moon was full and the owls hooted. The wind blew the trees back and forth, creak, creak, creak. The trees made sounds as the floorboards did in the shed with Danny and Jesse. The boys stood in the back of the shed looking at a hatch on the ground. Jesse, being the stronger one, pulled and pulled until it budged. Stairs led down to a passage which led to a room of evil and hate. Cages of bodies hung from the ceiling, bodies laid on tables with bite marks in them. Legs, arms, feet, hands were everywhere. The room smelt of rotten, decomposed body parts. The room was lit by 2 candles. Tools hung from the wall, ropes, bats, hooks, and wire, all were there hanging on the wall, just looking at you as if you were looking into death. The boys were horrified. They had to get out of there, but just as they were about to go up the stairs, a door slammed shut. Footsteps were heard from above. Shit, we got to hide or we're fucked. Danny trembled. The 2 boys hid behind tables of dead bodies. The figure was now at the bottom of the steps. I smell fresh blood, the voice said. It was deep and wicked, like a devilish tone. Jesse peeked out of the corner. What he saw was wicked, it was beyond terrifying. A man stood there with razor-sharp teeth, pointed ears, and evil eyes. Blacker than the deepest part of sea, and a soul eviler than the devil itself, for that was not a man but a thing. A thing that could not exist, in such a world. He walked toward the wall and grabbed the hooks. He whispered in such a twisted voice a chant that they couldn't understand, like a devil worshipper would say. He came over to the boys, got the bat and swung. Danny was knocked out and Jesse stood there watching his friend bleed. The cannibal took the hook and drove it up Jess's neck. Blood poured out of his neck and all over the floor. The cannibal stood over the dead body, cupping his hands to get as much blood as he could. He poured it all over his face like a cool, refreshing drink in the heat of the summer. Danny woke up strapped to a table. Limbs cut off, no legs, no arms. He saw his friend hanging from the ceiling by a rope, his neck slit open. He started shouting. The cannibal came back down in a mask. He held a huge knife in his hand. Without saying a thing, he stabbed it into the center of Danny's stomach. Blood spewed out of his body. The cannibal licked the bloody body with his pointed tongue. He reached in the torso with his ragged long nails and pulled out Danny's heart. Blood dripped down as the thing took a huge bite into the heart, his mouth with bloody with flesh in between his teeth as he screamed a devilish roar that echoed through the eerie night sky. Third story. This story was shared by you/spaghetti_Mercury. Stay away from the bead ranch. I considered not going to my friend's housewarming party. If I hadn't, I would have never known the horror that was sitting right up the road. I'd have never heard the strange story of the bead ranch. Pronounced BD. Another one of my friends got married. Another one bites the dust. It's become more and more common in recent years. This time, it was my childhood best friend Tiffany. Tiff met Joe days after arriving on campus during her freshman year of college. They fell in love quickly. He seems like a great guy and I get along with him. Shortly after getting married, they found a place relatively closer to where Tiff works. She is extremely intelligent and has a great job. The commute was crazy though. The place was still almost an hour away from her work, which was better than her previous commute. It's about 2 hours from our hometown where I still live. It was a bit of a haul to go to their housewarming party, but I did tell her that I wouldn't miss it for the world. The party was okay and I saw some old friends. I was happy to see that they were happy. They found a nice little place on a lake that they apparently got a great deal on. The party was run-of-the-mill and I didn't care much about it other than hanging out with Tiff and Joe. I decided that I wouldn't drink because I had to work the following morning and would need to drive home that night. I met their new friends who are locals of the area. Andy and Lauren were a friendly couple and they stayed to the end of the night. It was after most everyone had left that they told me the story of a family who lived nearby. A story I initially struggled to believe. Everything was winding down and it was just me, Joe, Tiff, and their new friends from the area, Andy and Laura. We were all sitting in a circle, smoking pot and shooting the shit. You don't care at all what religion the president is? Andy asked the group. Why would I? Tiff laughed. It could be a religion that practices human sacrifice. Andy laughed. Okay. Okay, do you care if the president was gay? What reason would there be to care? I laughed. I couldn't care less who the president wants to get with as long as they're, adult humans. Same way it doesn't matter to me what anyone cares to eat. As long as it isn't human. Well, make sure to stay away from the old bead ranch then, Andy replied. Why? I asked. Do they have gay presidents that eat people? Andy was chuckling, but his face turned serious strangely quickly. Laura had a very serious look on her face. You guys haven't heard anything about the bead ranch? Andy asked Joe and Tiff. Nothing. Why? Tiff asked. Shit, I'm surprised the realtor didn't say something when you moved in here, Laura said. Oh God. What is it? Joe asked. The Bead family, Laura somberly replied. There was a weirdly tense moment after she said that. Neither Andy or Laura were laughing in the slightest. After a short pause, Laura told us the story. Fay Hollow, the town directly to the west of us just a few minutes down the road, is all owned by this very strange and reclusive family. I think it's considered a hamlet, because it's not big enough to be considered a town. It's basically just a big chunk of land with one old dirt road going through it. From all accounts, it's not very good land either. It's mostly all swamp with a small river that runs off from the lake. People who've been there say it's just ugly. You've never been there? Tiff asked. We know better, Andy replied. Joe and Tiff both looked a little spooked. Laura took a long sip of her drink and then continued. Some years back, the town wanted to build a highway through some of this area. There were plans to build a factory here. They were planning on bringing in new businesses. Most of the people around here were all for it. Outside of the nice houses on the lakes, it's historically been a very low-income area. There just isn't much nearby and there aren't a lot of job opportunities. Yeah, my commute is like an hour now, Tiff said. Still worth it for a nice affordable house on the lake. For those of us who can afford it, Laura said. There are plenty who can't. There were a lot more back then. The population used to be much higher here. Now it's primarily summer homes or people who have really long commutes. Tiff almost looked like she felt guilty or had taken some offense. Laura quickly got back to the story. Most locals were excited about the highway and all of the new businesses that might come. Everyone who needed to sign off on it did, aside from the beads. Locals who would need to move were offered much more than market value for their homes. Most of them felt like they won the lottery. The Beatties wouldn't budge though. Their family had owned that chunk of land for generations. They dug in their heels. People were pissed. Laura paused again to get another drink. So let me guess, the townspeople raced over there with pitchforks and killed them? Joe asked. Now the ghosts haunt the land, he laughed. Was I close? No, but maybe they should have, Andy replied in a serious tone. There was another short but awkward pause before Laura returned and sat back down. So, what happened? Tiff asked. The story starts to get murky, Laura replied. There had already been plenty of rumors about the family. People claimed that they practiced incest. Some believed they were cannibals. These were all theories most likely due to their appearance and their decision to live in isolation. People might have heard about the disappearances, and let their imaginations fill in the blanks. Or maybe they were right about the beads. What locals did know was that anyone who wandered onto their property were greeted with shotguns. So they were just like Florida people. Joe laughed. Laura ignored the comment and continued. The town continued surveying different spots in the area, hoping that they could still convince the beads to sell. 2 men, Thomas and Paul, were sent to the hamlet to survey what they could as well as try again to talk to the family. She continued as we all quietly listened. Thomas has told his story. He checked out the area near the front of the land by the start of the dirt road that runs through the property and acts as a shortcut to the interstate. Paul went into the weeds and bushes so he wouldn't be seen. He was going to check out the swamp. Before long, Thomas heard thrashing followed by gunshots alongside terrible screams. What happened to Paul? Tiff asked. No one knows, Laura replied. Thomas ran out of there and promptly called the cops. They found nothing. No sign of Paul at all. He's still considered missing and presumed dead. Thomas has theorized that Paul had been cannibalized. They could never prove it though. No evidence. Since then, people steer clear of Fay Hollow and the Beatty family. Maybe a bear got him, Joe said. Maybe, Laura replied. There were others though. Some are on record as missing. Some are just stories. But it seems like every few years, someone goes missing near the Bede Ranch. It's enough to make locals steer clear. Is it really a shortcut to the interstate? I asked. It's a straight shot, Andy said. The dirt road ends about a mile from the on-ramp to 86. It would seriously take at least 45 minutes less to get there than the main roads. That's why they wanted to build the highway. I laughed. People really won't take that road because they're afraid of this family. People don't want to get shot, Laura replied. That, or something worse. The stories could have been exaggerated, but the disappearances are very real. What keeps random people driving through from going down that road? I asked. The turn to the road is at the end of a road with a dead-end sign at the entrance. There isn't a reason for most people to go down there. There's also no trespassing and posted signs everywhere leading to it. I had friends who went down there and took pictures. It's really creepy. The dirt road doesn't fully show up in the maps either, so most people don't know that it goes to the interstate if they're not from here, Laura replied. Your friends went to the ranch? Joe asked. Just to the edge of the road, Laura replied. They knew not to go any further, not to trespass. Kids at school called it the Bleedy Ranch. Sounds like those Bleedies stand their ground. Joe laughed. Something like that, Laura quietly replied. I was very skeptical. I asked them, have you guys ever seen this family? Just the youngest one, Andy replied. She used to come in about once a week when I was working at the gas station up the road. Bought a lot of gas. She's actually pretty cute, in an Amish sort of way. That's messed up, Laura said, looking mildly irritated. Not as cute as you. Andy laughed. No, I'm talking about how people think she might have been kidnapped. The Bedes don't associate with anyone outside of their family and she sure doesn't look inbred. Some people think she was kidnapped when she was a baby and raised as a Bede. I don't doubt it, Andy replied. The topic of conversation changed shortly after that, but I couldn't stop thinking about this place. Could I really cut 45 minutes off of my drive home? It's such a long boring drive. It was crazy to me that people would avoid a shortcut like that just because they've seen too many scary movies. About a half hour later, I knew that I needed to leave. I was already looking at a night of very little sleep. I had an important meeting and presentation at work in the morning. Joe and Tiff tried to talk me into staying, but I simply couldn't. Hooray for work. As I reached the top of their long driveway, I stopped for a moment and thought about Fay Hollow. They warned me not to take the shortcut, but they didn't have a long drive ahead of them. I looked it up in maps on my phone. Laura was right about only half the road showing up on there. Looking at the map though, it didn't seem like there was any logical place for it to end aside from where they said it did. My main concern was getting to the end of the road and finding out it didn't actually come out by the interstate. I figured that if the road was a dead end, it would only add an extra 20 minutes or so to my trip. If I had to drive the long way, I wasn't gonna get any sleep either way. I decided to opt for the shortcut. I followed the map to the road with a dead-end sign at the entrance. I started slowly driving down it. It wasn't long before I started seeing no trespassing signs and posted signs on the trees. There weren't any houses on this road and it seemed to lead straight into a swamp. I got all the way to the end before I saw the turn to Bede Road. The turn was somewhat hidden by weeds and bushes. The cement ended and the dirt road was tough to see in the dark at first. There was a gate, but I could see from the car that it wasn't locked. The gate and surrounding trees were absolutely covered and no trespassing signs. I have to admit that I was a little creeped out. The excessive amount of signs in front of the dark dirt road made me slightly uneasy. As did seeing the sign for Bead Road. This means that the family isn't fictional. I considered it for a minute and decided that the creepiness of the road itself is probably where these stories come from. I remember being a kid and assuming any creepy-looking, boarded-up, or run-down house must be haunted. Sometimes our imagination gets the better of us. Not tonight though. I had come this far and I was taking this shortcut. I got out and walked over to the gate. It was an old rusty X-shaped gate, just big enough to prevent cars from getting through. It creaked loudly as I swung it open. The sound echoed through the eerily quiet night. I admitted to myself that I was a little creeped out, but I still didn't believe Laura's stories. Creepy-looking places spawn creepy stories. Stereotypes can lead to urban myths. Stereotypes like the Beads being seen as inbred cannibal rednecks because they live in relative isolation. These are the things I was telling myself as I started driving down the dark dirt road. I kept my speed low because of the wooded areas on each side of the road. The last thing I needed was to hit a deer. The road eventually turned slightly around a bend, and that's when I saw the lights in the distance. I assumed it had to be in their house. Andy and Laura said it was the only one along the road or inside the tiny hamlet. I crept slowly down the road. The lights were growing bigger but I still couldn't see the house. I started hearing a noise that I eventually recognized as the sound of a generator. These people really were off the grid. I started wondering where they got the money for gas to power the generator, where they got money for food, supplies, etc. Laura would likely say that they stole it from their many victims. While I still didn't believe that, the thought was stuck in my head. I admit that I was feeling more nervous as I got closer to the house. I could see a spot ahead where the weeds and trees opened up. I was almost to the house and I was about to be visible to anyone who might be there. I had freaked myself out a little bit more than I realized before, so I decided to pick up my speed as I was passing the house. I figured that even if they were the type to shoot anyone they saw on their property, I could get past the house before they could even grab their shotguns. I sped up a little as I got to a point where I could be seen from the house. I saw that there was lights on, but didn't spot anyone outside or through the windows. The house was a little shabby, but honestly not much worse looking than my last place. It could use a paint job, but there are worse looking houses in the town I live in. Seeing the house calmed my nerves a bit. It wasn't as spooky as what I built up in my head. Still spooky, just not as spooky as I imagined. I still wanted to get past it and out of sight quickly. I started to pass the house and looked ahead down the long dirt road where the opening in the trees closed up and it was almost too dark to see right in front of you. I pressed the gas a little harder as I passed, then abruptly I felt the steering tighten and the car slow. I had popped a tire. This is what I like to call an "of course" moment. I quickly hopped out to check the damage. My front right tire was flat. I momentarily considered driving on it at least to the end of the dirt road. Then I thought about it and decided that I might let Laura's story creep me out a bit, but I'm not gonna destroy my rim because of it. I was practically right in front of the house. I might have gotten 10 or 15 feet past it, but the light from the porch made me clearly visible to anyone inside. I looked toward the house regularly as I popped the trunk and grabbed the spare tire. I still hadn't seen any people, but there were definitely lights on inside that I thought that maybe I should call someone, but as I looked at my phone I saw that I had no service. Of course not. I was in a swamp in the middle of nowhere. As I was rolling the tire from the trunk to the front of the car, I spotted something strange on the ground. I used the light from my phone to get a closer look. I felt a chill when I realized what it was. It was a small piece of wood with several nails driven through it. The nails were straight through and unbent, sticking straight up. My tolerance for coincidence was fading. It looked like a man-made item, specifically put there to pop someone's tires. I shined my phone's flashlight a little further up the dirt road and noticed another one, then another, then another. I walked maybe 20 feet ahead and found more than a dozen of these little spike strips, a minefield of pointy objects. The feeling of panic started rapidly growing. I'm not sure if the plan was to jump in the car and drive it on a flat or if I was going to try to change it as quickly as humanly possible. It didn't matter though. When I turned around and looked back toward the house, I noticed a man coming from the house toward me. I could just see his silhouette as he went from walking to running. I quickly realized that he was wielding something and he started to yell. Panic immediately took over. I had idiotically walked too far from my car, so I turned and started running further down the road. I didn't know why they were laying down homemade spike strips and I didn't want to find out. To me, everything else could have been chalked up to coincidence. Not the spike strips though. As I started to run, I could hear the man yelling but I couldn't make out what he was saying. My heart was racing and I had no idea where I was going or what I was planning to do. When I looked back, I saw a second man coming out of the house. He was standing directly in the porch light for a moment and I could see clearly that he was holding a rifle. He yelled as well but I couldn't make it out. Then he also started running toward me. I couldn't believe what was happening. I felt stupid for taking the shortcut despite a direct warning not to. I could already feel my sides hurting. I was running short of breath. I had no plan. All I could do was run and hope that the men chasing me either gave up or lost track of me. I considered cutting into the swamp, but I figured they probably knew their way through it better than me and it would only slow me down. I felt helpless. I could hear them continuing to yell and scream as I started to feel like I couldn't run anymore. The only word I could make out was, "Stop." At this point, I wasn't looking back to see if they were gaining on me. I was just trying to force myself to keep running. I tried to fight through the cramps, shortness of breath, sore legs, and dizzy feeling. Then I abruptly felt a sharp pounding pain in each side of my rib cage. I was stopped dead in my tracks as my head and arms flew forward while the rest of my body stopped. Momentarily. It was dark and I couldn't tell what was happening at first. I could only focus on the searing pain I felt. I realized that something was wrapped around my torso. It felt like marble when I touched it. I could barely see it in the dark and in the frenzy, but I could tell that it was large. The pain intensified as I was lifted off of the ground. Whatever had a hold of me flailed me around more than 10 feet off of the ground. I could see the two men had made it almost to me and stopped. The man with the gun began firing shots. I couldn't see what he was shooting at as I was being thrashed around in the dark. After he fired about 3 shots, I was thrown to the ground. The one man was throwing rocks and other random objects. I looked up and saw what had grabbed me. It was unbelievable. I tried to crawl back despite a few likely broken ribs. I looked up to see a massive humanoid creature. It must have been 25 feet tall. It was tough to tell as it was standing in the swamp water. It had a long, skinny body and lanky arms with a kind of claw at the end of each. The claws were like ant mandibles that connected at the tip rather than fitting flush when closed. It was one of those claws that it had grabbed me with. I'm lucky the claw didn't close flush, because I wouldn't be here to tell the story if it had. I continued slowly crawling backward as the two men fought off the creature. As the man with the gun tried to line up a shot, the other flashed a light at the creature. This was the clearest I was able to see it. It had two very large eyes that seemed to extend halfway around its oval-shaped head. Its skin was a dark gray or black. Its head was more of a grayish-blue. The eyes were black with a fluorescent, thin blue ring around the edges. Everything happened so fast. The man with the gun told the other guy to try and distract the creature with the light as he reloaded. The man flashed the light in the creature's face, then pointed it toward the trees hoping to grab its attention. It didn't work. The next few moments are seared into my brain. I was first distracted by a young woman yelling and running toward us from the house. I continued dragging myself in terror before I looked back. The man with the rifle was attempting to reload when the creature spiked down through his torso with one of the large claws. It pierced straight through him and into the ground underneath. The creature quickly turned its attention toward the guy with the light. He started to turn and run before the creature grabbed him the same way it had grabbed me. It swung him back and forth before slamming him into a tree. I screamed in horror as the creature then picked up his lifeless body and pulled it toward its face. Its mouth opened like a flap, revealing a circular mouth filled with multiple spiraling rows of teeth. It pulled the lifeless man close. Then its mouth seemed to extend out a few feet in a bizarre fashion. It devoured the man in what felt like less than a minute. The woman made her way to me and helped me to my feet. The creature picked up the other man's body and prepared to eat him as well. The woman helped me walk toward the house. She told me that the creature was injured, and wouldn't chase after us. I didn't know if she was just saying that to calm me down though. When it felt like we were at a remotely safe distance, I had to stop for a moment. I puked on the ground next to me as I tried to process what I had just witnessed. I forced myself to continue walking with the aid of the woman and we made it into the house. I couldn't catch my breath. I was sobbing. She was holding it together much better than I was. It took a minute for me to realize that I had just unintentionally gotten two of her family members killed. I started apologizing profusely despite not knowing exactly what had happened. She continuously said, "Relax," and, "It's not your fault." I babbled in my panic. I screamed, "They were trying to help me. It's my fault." The young woman introduced herself as Lily. She was a pretty girl probably in her mid-20s wearing old-timey looking clothes. She assured me that she didn't believe it was my fault. I had no way of knowing what was lurking down that road. I still felt an insurmountable amount of guilt. I wanted to save an hour or so on my drive. So I trespassed on clearly posted property. She said that we would talk once I calmed down. She got me a glass of water and a few painkillers for my ribs. I was cut open on each side but the cuts weren't too deep. I would find out later I had multiple cracked and bruised ribs. The physical pain was so far in the back of my mind though. I felt that I had gotten two men killed. I was still trying to understand what that thing was. Lily was very pleasant to me. She was very kind, especially considering the circumstances. It turned out that the two men were her uncles. I again apologized upon learning that, but she again told me that I wasn't at fault. "We've always known the risks of living here," she said. "You couldn't have known. They also could have done a better job of warning you. If someone was chasing me with a shotgun and screaming, I would have run too." "What is that thing?" I asked. "How long has it been there?" "It's been there longer than I've been alive," Lily replied. "It saved my granny years ago when she was in trouble. She believed that she had a bond with it. Granny passed last year. She bought this land years ago after discovering the creature. She did everything she could to deter anyone from coming here. She never wanted to report it to any agency though. She felt that it had just as much of a right to live as we do. She claimed that it wasn't trying to hurt anyone, but would protect itself if it felt threatened." I wanted to ask follow-up questions, but I sat quietly and listened to Lily. "We have never known if the creature is a new species, an experiment of some sort, or even an alien. We know that it's been injured for years and doesn't move far from its spot. It seems to need the water to survive like a fish. It manages to get everything it needs from the swamp. We give it treats here and there and our leftovers, but it seems to survive just fine without us. It has been for over 40 years. That's why your family didn't sign off on the highway." "Yes," she replied. "The creature saved Granny, and she knew it would be killed and most likely experimented on if she told anyone about it. Granny was nervous about people anyway, so it was easier to just keep it a secret. I've always known the risks. My uncles did too. I'm so sorry." I repeated again. "Don't be," she softly replied. "Just relax and get some rest. I'll answer all your questions in the morning." "Thank you. Would you like to watch a movie?" she asked. I was a little surprised they had a TV, let alone movies. "Yes, we have movies," Lily laughed. She popped in Jurassic Park and I tried to relax as the painkillers started to kick in. She watched the movie with me for a while before heading to bed herself shortly before Dennis steals the dinosaur embryos. I eventually was able to fall asleep and slept soundly until the morning. It wasn't before I looked out the window about 50 times, trying to catch a glimpse of the creature again. The morning came and I felt as though I'd been hit by a train. I could smell bacon and realized that Lily had cooked breakfast. I was grateful, but still uncomfortable being treated so nicely by someone whose family members I essentially got killed. I hoped for a brief moment that it had all been a dream. I thought about the work meeting and presentation that I was missing, but I couldn't even begin to force myself to care. Learning of the existence of this creature is so mind-blowing that going to work felt so insignificant. I saw another glass of water and another painkiller on the stand and promptly took it. I then got up, ready to go change my tire. Lily walked into the living room. She insisted that I eat breakfast before I go. I agreed with little resistance. I had already missed work. Once I get cell service, I'll probably have 30 missed calls. It's tough to care much about that though. I sat down at the kitchen table with Lily. I wanted to ask more questions about the creature, but I wasn't sure if it was a sore subject that I should avoid. I didn't have to ask though. "It isn't a vengeful creature," she said abruptly. "Do you feel safe living near it?" I asked. "It's obviously dangerous. It's just an animal like the rest of us," she replied. "Maybe it's something left over from a forgotten era. Maybe it's something new. It keeps to itself unless someone bothers it. It protects itself like anyone else would. Who are we to decide what gets to live or die? Granny hated hubris, and hubris is a very human trait. Humans kill rodents and pests because they're a nuisance. We kill animals for food or even sport. We cage anything that might be a threat to us. Maybe we aren't meant to be the dominant species anymore. Maybe those swamp creatures are. It may have been the pain medication talking, but I found myself agreeing with her. Do you care about that thing? I asked. I care about Granny, and she cared about it. She softly replied. Granny felt bad about stopping the highway from being built. It isn't fair to stop progress to protect our own comfort. We had a good run, but maybe the world isn't ours anymore. We finished breakfast and I went outside to change my tire. I walked up to my car to find that my tire was already changed. Of course it was. The inbred cannibal changed it for me. The same one whose family tried to stop me from walking into certain death. Who died to save me. I felt like I owed Lily so much. She's all alone now because of me. Well, I guess not all alone. I knew that I wouldn't report seeing the creature. Maybe I'll tell the story to people who won't take it seriously anyway, but I won't call the authorities. I owe her that much. She walked out the front door and I thanked her for helping me yet again by changing my tire. I thanked her again for everything she had done for me, for forgiving me. Are you sure you're comfortable being alone here? I asked. The creature isn't going to harm me. It was simply protecting itself, and protecting its own. She said. Yeah. Wait. What do you mean by that? I asked, confused. Lily went inside for a moment. When she returned, she had a photograph. I looked at it and the hairs on my neck stood up. I asked her, are those eggs? Lily smiled from ear to ear and said, she's gonna be a mama. I didn't know how to respond. I initially tried burying the thought in the back of my mind. I gave Lily a hug and we said our goodbyes. I started driving back the way I came along the dirt road, now content to go the long way. It probably takes hundreds of years for those creatures to grow to adulthood. She said that one had been there for decades. I won't even be aware of them in my lifetime. At least that's what I keep trying to tell myself. I reached the end of the dirt road. I stopped and looked back for a minute, blown away by the experience, terrified of what's to come. My phone started going off as I reached cell service. I'm gonna get fired. It's likely that no one will believe my story and maybe that's okay. Maybe it's just the way things are meant to be. People will likely continue spreading rumors about the inbred cannibals living in the swamp. Doesn't really matter though. What matters is to heed the warning when someone tells you to stay the fuck away from the Beat Ranch. Fourth story. This story was shared by you/BingusWriteStuff. Self-cannibalism. When I was 9 years old, I thought fighting was cool because of action cartoons I watched on a Sunday morning. Needless to say, my mind quickly changed as I trembled in the corner, watching Ashley's dad slam Ashley's mom's head on a dining table until its newly formed cracks in the wood became miniature rivers of blood. I trembled. Ashley didn't even flinch. She was used to it. In hindsight, I should have told somebody. I knew there was something horribly wrong with Ashley's family, but when I brought up the prospect of telling some authority figure what was happening, Ashley wouldn't even hear it. She begged me not to tell anyone, yet I persisted. Where begging failed, threatening succeeded. She told me she wouldn't be my friend anymore. I was a shy, and obviously stupid kid, and I didn't want to lose the only friend I had. I kept my mouth shut. There was a certain rhythm to each visit I made. A certain protocol. Chain of events, perhaps. Ashley and I would knock and wait for her mother to let us in. I despised that fake, plastic smile of hers. There was not a single spark of genuine emotion behind those thin, flaccid lips and those hollow, sunken orbs of misery. Now, where was I? Yes. Yes. Chain of events. Upon entering, Ashley's mother would lock the door behind us and we would march straight to the corner of the living room where Ashley kept a spacious cardboard box that wasn't utilized to even 1/5 of its capacity. That small bundle of hand-me-downs was hardly enough for one childhood. Priorities were priorities, though. How could Ashley expect a new toy if her family was running low on necessities, like that clear, foul-smelling liquid that her father seemed to cherish more than his wife and child? I grabbed my favorite item from that humble pile. A pair of binoculars with a camo pattern on them. From our little playground in the corner, we had a clear view on the open door of the little kitchenette, just big enough for a stove, counter and a small asymmetrical dining table with 3 chairs accompanying it. Then, the first deviation of the rigid protocol happened. Usually, the crooked figure of a run-down homemaker was obscured, we could only see her thin shadow dancing across the table as she hurriedly prepared dinner. I blinked in disbelief a few times before gazing back to Ashley. She, too, was surprised. Ashley's mother was slumped over in one of the chairs, her head resting on the table. Almost unnoticeable twitches accompanied her burdened sighs. Slowly, meticulously she guided her hands to her lap before grasping something and placing it on the table in front of herself. It was a small, clear vase with a single rose inside. All my time I knew her, I had never seen Ashley's mom decorating anything. She simply didn't have the time for such an endeavor. I remember thinking to myself that rose was an obvious fake. Where on earth would roses black as coal from the steam to the petals grow? She rose up and straightened her posture on that chair before pulling the vase a little bit closer to herself. Her left hand disappeared under the table yet again, only to re-emerge seconds later holding something. I didn't realize what it was until she guided her right hand above the vase and turned her wrist upwards and placed the slender, curved object on it before furiously sliding it across. She turned her wrist downward and allowed the crimson liquid to feed the rose. Not a slight hint of pain stood on her face. Every single distinguishable feature she had transformed itself into a shining beacon of determination and focus. As blood went downwards, grim, thick smoke erupted upwards from the petals. Before the engulfing curtain overshadowed her face, I could see a quick smile flash across her pale lips. Footsteps echoed through the house and Ashley and I exchanged a worried look. Was her dad home already? Those footsteps didn't sound like they belonged to her father. Papa is home, she whispered. I'm going to greet him, she concluded, standing up. A chilling realization compelled me to grab Ashley's arm and pull her back down. Ashley, I muttered, the door is locked. Footsteps echoed through the separate hallway that connected the kitchen to the main door. The chair slid out by itself, emanating an uneasy screech before a black figure seated herself opposite of Ashley's mother. It was tall and slender, and it bore a distinct note of femininity within it. Its gracious slender figure was topped off by a wide-brimmed hat, as dark as the rest of it. I raised the binoculars to my eyes. Now, I could see the black smoke was slowly emanating from the figure itself. Behind the figure, Ashley's mother was talking and articulating with her hands, yet we couldn't hear a sound fleeing from her lips. As abruptly as she sat, the figure stood up, once again revealing its full height. A branch-like hand placed something on the table before turning herself towards the hallway. It was then that I yet again looked through binoculars just as it began to walk. I was too craven to look at her profile, so I instinctively looked downwards, towards her legs. It was then that I found out that this thing walked not with legs, but with hooves. As the thing disappeared into the hallways, a sudden surge of bravery befell me and I attempted to see what was it that was placed on the table. My noble attempt was late, though. Whatever it was, Ashley's mother clasped it with both hands in a protective manner. She slid it over to herself and stood up. Just then, a hard, impatient knock struck against the door. I recognized it. It was him. Me and Ashley withdrew deeper into the corner, not knowing how the encounter between her father and that mysterious visitor played out. Ashley's mother swiftly left her post in the kitchen and walked over to the door, unlocking it and greeting her husband. "Hello, darlin'," she almost sang, "had a good day at work?" "Stop pretending to care, damn whore. Give me something to eat," he growled. We heard the sound of his heavy work boots echo through the hallway. "Of course, love," she replied in that uncanny, melodic voice as if he just sang her a ballad. He seated himself at the same spot where the visitor was. Ashley's mother placed a place in front of him and walked over to the door, looking at us. "Papa needs some alone time. You kids will eat in the living room. I'll bring you food in a moment," she explained before shutting the door. Before she closed it, I took one last look at the table. The vase was nowhere to be seen. We sat there in the corner, talking in hushed voices about what we had just seen. Then, our conversation was interrupted by a loud crash. Ah, yes. The beginning of a fight. It seemed that the chain of events was restored. It was now time for the most disturbing part. The part where Ashley's mother would start screaming. We sat there in silence, waiting for it to begin. It began. Yet these screams were deeper. Guttural. Screams, incoherent mutters and gurgling sounds were all incorporated into some disgusting symphony. Ever so slightly, I edged towards that door. A peek through the keyhole was my goal. Sliding across the floorboards, I could not even begin to imagine what I would see there. I raised myself up on my knees, looked back towards Ashley, took a deep breath and placed my eye over the keyhole. Ashley's father was sitting on a table, his bare chest exposed. He utilized the knife and fork for the task of tearing his own flesh and stuffing it into his mouth, chewing between the whispers of absolute agony. The hands continued, scrap after scrap. It seemed that they had a will of their own. I don't know how long I looked. I only know I looked away after his hands slid deep into his eye sockets and removed the eyeballs. The frantic movements of his neck told me that he had already swallowed the flesh and was ready for the next course. Last thing I saw through that keyhole before I stood up and ran across the living room to the door was Ashley's mom in the corner, smoking a cigarette, her thin, placid lips contorted in a satisfied smile. Luckily, Ashley's mother formed a habit of leaving a key in the door after her husband bashed her face in one day for taking too long to open it. I unlocked the door and ran, not looking back. I didn't see Ashley after that day. I saw worried faces and hushed conversations of other parents when mine would drop me off at school. Police arrived and questioned me. I explained to them that I was at Ashley's that day. The police and my parents exchanged worried glances. Their faces eased up after I told them that Ashley and I had a fight, and I left almost immediately after arriving and walked to the park where I played on the swings alone. I repressed memories of that day. I had almost forgotten them. I grew up and got married to the love of my life. The memories came back the first time he hit me. Ever so slowly, they returned. The tall, feminine figure, the man devouring himself. Then, this morning, after he splashed hot coffee at me for putting too much sugar in it before he left the house, I walked upstairs to our bedroom, wailing in agony, betrayal hurting me more than the actual scalding liquid. There on the nightstand stood a single black rose in a small vase. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/Muckling. The Cannibal. The cannibal lived on the 4th floor of a block of apartments, in the room right at the end of his corridor, with the battered brown door next to the window looking down over the complex. It was a grimy place. I doubt the gray carpet had ever been washed before, and now I think about it, I'm not even sure it was gray to begin with. I've never been a pinko or anything like that, but there was this conference a couple months ago where all the bleeding hearts of the liberal world gathered to alleviate their upper-middle-class guilt. And one of them said of a particular slum in the area, that it was a tomb for those not yet dead. I could say the same for the apartment building the cannibal lived in, and I'm very much entitled to say that, because I used to live there too. It was after they'd taken away my medical license, when I moved away from all of my family and friends and my old life and into this pit. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, just took the car and drove, bought the cheapest room I could find, sold the car and spent it all on my demons. Various things, prescription drugs, pills of all shapes and sizes, little bags of dust, anything to take my consciousness away for a few precious moments, to take my mind away from the living hell that my life had become. But you're not here because you want to listen to my story, I understand that. Yeah, for a long time, I lived next door to the cannibal. I can't tell you that he was a normal, well-adjusted person, because none of us were. But he was all right, I guess. He had no real crime to his name, besides being poor. He lived in filth, though, all the time that I knew him. I remember the first time he invited me in. Every inch of the place, every corner, and every surface, there was a layer of dust. Very thin, very fine, almost like the speckles of filth themselves were afraid of him. Like insects stuck to some web, waiting tersely to get eaten by some spider. He observed me as I went into the room, watching me closely, almost suspiciously, but he let me open the window when I asked him. We stood around in the silent squalor, then we watched the TV for a little bit, seated on the sofa. He was a perfect gentleman, let me have all my space without clawing at it like the rest of the jackals I'd encountered living there. I'd figured him for a junkie, I could tell that physically there was something wrong with him. But then he piped up, starting talking to me about drugs, started preaching. Telling me that there was something wrong with me. I told him that I was the fucking doctor, not him. He didn't know half what I knew. I became so angry. But right there, standing in the middle of the living room, he grabbed my forearm and stared right into my eyes. He had hazel eyes, a very gentle color, and he told me that I used to be a doctor, not anymore. A statement, like he knew something I didn't. And I don't know, maybe it was the proximity to another human being I hadn't felt since I'd left my life behind, maybe it was the honey tone of his voice, but I started crying. I sobbed into his shoulder while he held me, platonically, like a gentleman, like a brother. There I was, being cathartic, in the arms of a man I had known for 4 hours. So that was the first time that I met the cannibal, and that was pretty much how our relationship remained for the whole time I knew him. He wasn't interested in a partner of any sort, it was quite clear, but I was happy to have a friend in the world. And he healed me. He led me away from the cycle of sickness I'd fallen into, never giving in to my pleading in my throes of agony, or giving up even when I slipped away from him and relapsed, and that happened a number of times. But he believed in me, and my spirit. That is the man I choose to remember, the man I will never forget. Of this entire part of my life, that is the only thing I ever want to remember. I had been clean for 8 months when I started suspecting something. We saw each other every day, whenever we could, but still he refused to let me move in. He vanished every night, and he started to lock me in my own apartment when he was gone with a special lock outside my door he'd built himself. He kept the key on him all the time. He said he didn't trust me, not yet, and if I made it to 1 year free of drugs I'd have gained his trust. I know I trusted him, completely, without even the slightest doubt in my mind. I found out when I was at his place, around 5 in the afternoon. I was in the bathroom, and I knocked over the plastic bin he had accidentally. As I pushed its contents back in with my foot, I saw it, glittering innocently among the rest of the detritus. A pamphlet, glossy, black with red lettering, Hunger. I picked it up and flicked through it. It was very vague, a few diagrams of the human digestive system, mugshots, and a box with the following written on the back. You've made it far, young blood. We're ready for you. Bring your greatest friend in the world. You shall be content. Don't betray our trust. My first thought right there, cult. What else was I supposed to think about this man who'd saved my life? I knew him, but nothing about him, not his past, family, where he worked, where he went off to almost every night. I stormed out of that bathroom mad as hell, yelling into his face, stomping my feet, screaming like a child. He stared at me the whole time, with a genuine sadness etched on his face. Then he started yelling himself. Get out of here, I never want to see you again. Don't look at me. Go somewhere they won't find you. And he cried, sat down on the doorstep and cried as I rushed away from him in disgust. I ran out of the building and into the night, and I spent until morning in the underground, my face soaked in tears, sleeping next to the ticket machine. I lay with my face on the cold floor, and when I woke up, freezing, I made my way back. They told me all about the cult he was in later, the police. A cannibal cult, operating with people in circumstances such as I was in. Using their members as confidence tricksters, nasty business, demons and all that, very unfortunate. I don't remember much about when they found him, that day when I wandered back into the apartment building despite his warning. I remember drifting up the stairs, like a dream. I remember bumping into a policeman, who turned and looked at me with pity, like he knew something I didn't. I remember making my way down the corridor, my feet shuffling along the gray carpet, past my apartment door, past the police who couldn't stop me, through the tape, yelling I'm a doctor and I love that man, kneeling next to him, as he mouthed I couldn't betray you, and they're punishing me for betraying them, as he coughed up blood, as the leeches burst out of his intestines and onto my hands and onto the floor. They're punishing me for loving you. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.